Hi all, welcome back once again. This is the first and only lecture in our initial review of video media, and it is late on top of that. I wound up pretty much entirely rewriting this lectured script in order to respond more directly to the comments and the points that you all raised based on last week's videos in the check-in. I know it may seem a little odd to only be providing one video lecture in this unit, less than in other areas of the course, and you're not wrong. Part of the reason was logistical. There was just a lot of stuff to watch last week, and I didn't want to add even more to that. And partly, I wanted your initial reactions to those assigned videos on editing to be less filtered in terms of responding to my interpretation of the material. I wanted it to be more raw. But also, if I had to boil down these 2 weeks of video to a single take-home point, it would be that in instructional design, and especially media-centric, multimodal instructional design, very often less is more. On a very basic level, it's better to have just one good video lecture than two not-so-good video lectures. But that is just the beginning of what I mean, and it's why I wanted to emphasize editing over all the other available types of semiotic signs in video media. Quite a few of you admitted during last week's check-in to being skeptical about the premise of comparing instructional design to film editing, and I'm sure some of you still are skeptical, and that's really good. It's definitely a bit of an unusual idea in some regards, and you were right to question how useful and relevant this can be to your actual work as educators, which is, of course, what I want to be supporting. So I went back and rewrote this lecture in order to address that, which is why this is going up late. So I apologize again for that. Thank you for your patience, and I'm not going to make you wait any longer, so let's get going. So quite a lot of you chose to respond last week to the crash course video. I'd say probably 80 to 85% of the class picked that as their favorite, which I didn't necessarily anticipate ahead of time, but I think I can see why that happened. So let's talk about what you liked about it and what made that video stick out more than the rest. So while this video is about the role of the editor, it's also about how a movie's structure takes shape over the course of the editing process. First, just to define the relationship between those two terms, structure is the overall shape of a design or a media object, the arrangement of the individual parts into an understandable order, hopefully a meaningful and a logical order that supports learning. That's what I mean by structure. And editing is the set of decisions that are made in order to create structure. So this is why I emphasized editing in last week's materials, because I think that this is the unique and remarkable affordance of video media from a design perspective, the affordance of structure. Now, I'm not saying that other media don't have structure, because they obviously do, and we've talked about that. But with video, it is both easier to observe in some ways and potentially much more difficult to execute and do well. Structure is so important to video that the Media Insider identifies editing, all of those decisions that add up to structure, as a semiotic category in its own right, on par with the use of cinematography or sound. And the same holds true in instructional design in some very similar ways. Structure is the end goal of the editing process, and the quality of an editing decision is going to be measured by how well it fits into the overall structure of a design. Emily keyed in on this, and a couple of other people responded along similar lines, that the challenge of editing as an instructional designer is in making all those decisions and transitions that are underlying the lesson feel natural, which can be really hard. We've all had lessons, either as students or teachers, where the pieces were all fine on their own. They were all good, but the whole thing just didn't work as well as it should have because somewhere in the structure of the lesson design, there were some choices that didn't fit together right. They were okay choices just on their own merits, but they didn't fit with each other and it undermined the whole thing, like trying to force two puzzle pieces together, which you can do, but then you're never actually going to reach the best version of the fully assembled puzzle if you do that, because your pieces are not lined up as well as they could be. Several of you, I'm thinking of Rock and Jenna, specifically did not like the Folding Ideas video because I think it didn't really have a clear structure beyond here are a bunch of examples of different video editing cuts in no particular order, and isn't this neat? Where each example given was a good illustration of the thing it was talking about, but they didn't really add up to any final clear structure by the end, which is a very fair criticism of that video. Okay, so enough setting the stage. Let's get back to discussing the concepts from the crash course video, which, like I said, probably 85% of you picked that as the primary thing you liked and responded to last week. And we are going to connect those concepts from Crash Course and this idea of structure into instructional design with some help from our old friend, the TPAC diagram. In last week's framing commentary, I drew an analogy based on the Media Insider video between the three other categories of signs he defined: mise-en-scène, camera work, and cinematography, and sound. And this three-part diagram we're already familiar with. You've got three distinct domains of background knowledge that have to be accounted for in your design, and they all have to fit together smoothly in your finished structure. I don't think this is a particularly insightful observation about the similarity between video editing and the TPAC model, but I don't think it's totally baseless either. But that begs the question, if we do this, where is editing in this picture, the fourth category? Well, it's right here. It is the TPAC construct itself. So this is the first thing where these concepts from video media can help us understand better about instructional design, because TPAC is an active body of knowledge in its own right. It's not just the intersection of other types of knowledge. It's in its own right on the same level with these larger primary domains that contribute. TPAC is the knowledge of how to combine those other domains and make design decisions that work together to structure a lesson or a class or a curriculum or whatever. Just like video editing knowledge is the technical knowledge of the different cuts and also the deeper structural knowledge of story and rhythm, TPAC is knowledge about both the particular features of its different parent domains and about how they can interact and be brought together in a design. So it has its own vocabulary in addition to drawing from the vocabulary of the other areas. So that's point one. Then point two, which many of you responded to, was the process laid out in the Crash Course video of the various different cuts of a movie that the editor creates, from the assembly cut at the very beginning, the very rough, raw version, to the final cut that actually gets shown to the audience. Dave and Olivia and Danae and a whole bunch of you all had great thoughts about how this process is reflected in your instructional design work. So let's look at that more closely. Way back in week one, when I was introducing TPAC, I said there is no one correct place to start when you're designing a lesson and trying to incorporate all these different knowledge domains. You can start anywhere and move through in any pattern as you're doing that. And at the beginning, that is true. You can start from any point And in fact, you're probably starting from more than one point in the sense that you have a lot of options, a lot of relevant knowledge that you potentially want to incorporate into the design at that initial stage. So this is the assembly cut phase where you're just kind of laying everything out that you've got and taking an initial look at the whole project. There's a technique from filmmaking that I've borrowed for this stage of design, of writing down all the scenes or the major beats in the footage onto their own individual index cards, and then using that to rearrange and move them around just to see the possibilities for how different elements might be organized and structured together. But once you start getting into the design process, by necessity, you start locking things into place, and you have to give up that open possibility space and start making hard decisions about what's going to fit with those initial decisions you've made and what is going to get cut out. You are establishing a structure, and the deeper you get into it, the quality of the elements themselves matters less and less, and how well they fit into the developing structure matters more and more. If you've ever watched deleted scenes on a DVD or an extended cut of a movie, you know that sometimes really good footage, really good scenes, wind up not making it into the final cut because they just don't fit into the structure of the movie. They slow it down and distract more than they contribute. And for that matter, the exact same thing can happen in instructional design. You might have a great video, for example, something that you really want to show your students, but it just doesn't fit with the particular lesson that you're creating. Maybe it's too long and you don't really have enough time to properly show it and let them digest it in your class. Maybe it's not quite appropriate for the grade level. Maybe the activity that you are planning the lesson around would be too disrupted by watching and referring to this video clip, but it just doesn't fit. And to be good designers, we need to recognize when that happens and be willing to drop the piece of the design that doesn't fit with the rest, even if it's good on its own merits and we really like it. Now, this is kind of a depressing way to think about this, the way I've just phrased it, so maybe a more productive perspective is to think about this in terms of constraints. I brought this up a couple weeks ago talking about constraints of audio versus graphics. And I said back then that a good instructional designer uses constraints to give shape to the lesson and focus students' attention in the direction they want. So what's happening as you establish the structure of your design and you're moving from something like an assembly cut to a rough cut where everything's in order and a fine cut where everything's pretty much locked in, is that you are locking in constraints that then tell you what is needed in the rest of the design to help you choose the right final elements from your repertoire of relevant knowledge to complete what you've started. So don't think of this as an excluding process. Think of this as refining and shaping, and a process that helps you and your students focus what you can do within well-designed constraints. And that point brings us to one more idea from the crash course video that several of you responded to, which was the overview of Walter Murch's Rule of Six, of the relative importance of different factors in deciding how to do each editing cut. Dan and a couple of other people picked up on this, and also on how it relates to collaboration in the editing and design process. Max and Kevin also touched on that collaborative element as well, as did several more of you. So Murch lays out 6 factors, but in the Folding Ideas video, he broke it down, the underlying concept of this, into a simple binary between technical and narrative cuts, which, and this is just my very unprofessional working definition, the difference between technical and narrative cuts are that one is the cuts, the choices you don't intend the audience to notice. That's the technical cuts. And then the choices you do intend the audience to notice. Those are the narrative cuts. I mentioned this last week, how the first three items in Murch's formulation are basically narrative factors of emotion, story, and rhythm, things that a regular viewer is supposed to be aware of and to notice. And those three together account for 84% of the total weight of everything in the Rule of Six diagram. While the other three factors are more technical. They're not really meant to be consciously noticed by the average viewer unless the editor is deliberately doing something unusual to draw attention to them. So those three narrative factors are the major factors that people will use to choose what they watch and how they watch it in video media. Emotion and story and rhythm taken together will determine a movie's genre, for example, whether it's a comedy or a love story or a thriller. But then within an individual movie, and this is the collaborative part, they sort of define the possibilities for what the watcher can pay attention to. There is generally more going on in movies and video media than we can easily pay attention to at one time, with different images and sounds, and it's all moving constantly. If you've ever rewatched a video for a detail you missed the first time, you know exactly what I'm talking about. And in badly structured video media, this richness is a liability. It just feels confusing and overwhelming, and you don't know where to focus or what you're supposed to be taking away from this. But in a well-structured movie and in a well-structured lesson plan, the possibilities and the overall direction are clear. The subtle technical cuts are smooth, they don't call attention to themselves, but just as importantly, the narrative cuts, decisions that went into the design are obvious to the average viewer, which is, of course, another way of describing affordances. The two readings this week, particularly the Teacher as Designer paper, give us some idea of how this works in instruction. This isn't the clearest image, unfortunately, but these are the 4 knowledge processes from that article of experiencing, conceptualizing, analyzing, and applying. And you'll notice that the language here is clearly influenced by the revised Bloom's taxonomy vocabulary. So all of these are decisions, sort of like cuts or moves, as the authors put it in the article, available to you and to your students in the course of a lesson. But without structure, if your students don't know what's expected or which of these directions to go in, that's not necessarily a good thing. So the role of structure, again, as you build your design, is to adjust the weight of these different choices, kind of like in the Rule of Six pie chart, so that it's clear which processes are essential and which are more peripheral in the given lesson. And because we're talking about a collaborative, interactive design process here, this is subject to adjustment, and you can even set it up so that different choices are highlighted depending on how the lesson goes and the specific circumstances of the student. Different processes become more obvious depending on those factors. We'll talk more about that next week when we get to interactive media. So that's structure and video media and instructional design in about 20 minutes or so, after you've already watched and read a couple solid hours worth of other content to prepare. So now I'd like to turn to a couple practical examples of structure in instructional design. Let's start with a really simple example of what I'm talking about. Say you have to design a lesson that involves a piece of video media, just hypothetically, I'm sure none of you will ever actually do this. Are you going to have your students watch the video at the start of the lesson, which I think is maybe the obvious default, or do you want to have them watch midway through after you've primed them with something, or at the end as a review activity for the rest of the lesson? This is a structural decision, and whichever way you do it will constrain how you conduct the other parts of the lesson, depending on timing and rhythm and whether your students have or don't have the information contained in the video at a given point in the lesson, and all those other factors. For that matter, are you going to show it just once or play back the video clip 2 or more times? Are you even going to play it during the lesson at all, or do you want to assign it as an out-of-class activity for them to do as homework the night before? The Teacher's Table video has several more ideas for how you can restructure a lesson involving video and use the media in ways that create interesting possibilities for lesson design. And that's just one factor. You're going to be making the same or similar decisions about how and when to do assessment, other activities, what order to present content information in. All of it is structural. So here I'll share an example from my own design process that includes a few factors altogether. This is a very sketchy outline of my plan for the first 2 media units of this course that we've already completed, graphics and audio, so weeks 2, 3, 4, and 5. I've tried to use color here to highlight the similarities between content in different weeks, and as you can see, there's a deliberate pattern. If you were to lay it out in a line, it would go red, blue, blue, red. So looking at the check-ins, just as an example, they go share something personal as a graphic, reading response, share something personal in audio form. And the whole 2-unit, 4-week arc is supposed to be laid out similarly. There are differences week to week too. Like I did lectures on affordance and then constraint back to back in weeks 3 and 4, bridging the jump between graphics and audio. So it's kind of going for variations on a theme, different angles on the same concept rather than precise repetition. In rhetoric and literature, this is called a chiastic structure, which is Greek for X-shaped, because laid out like this, you have these diagonal relationships with mirrored themes in opposite corners. Now, did this structural design approach work? That is for you to tell me. I make my own assessments, obviously, but really you're the ones who get to make the final judgment on that. But as you can see, once the pattern of the structure is decided on and the first pieces are in place, those decisions quickly constrain what I wound up doing in other areas and other weeks. I wanted to have the 2 Calansis and Cope chapters back to back to create continuity when we moved to studying a new medium from graphics to audio. And I also wanted to have a diverse range of readings in each medium, so that meant I had to find artistic or non-education specific sources for weeks 2 and 5 to create the balance I was shooting for between different types of readings and resources. So I hope that gives you just a glimpse of my design process. I will say I felt incredibly clever while planning this all out, probably way more clever than is really justified, but even if you all hated it, I had fun, which I think we can all agree is really the important consideration here. So now that I've revealed myself as a mad auteur obsessed with the deep structural importance of my own nonsense, I suppose this is as good a time as any to address the question of why I assigned you to watch Dance Your PhD videos to round out this first pass at video media. The first and most significant reason is that this is a really eye-catching example of creating instructional media under tight constraints. These are all research scientists. They're all experts in their content area. They are trained to report and communicate that expertise in their content area in very particular ways. And this contest challenges them to take that deep knowledge of content and also of reporting and communicating about science and express it all through a novel medium of dance, which their expertise and their work is very much not designed for. So there's a lot going on with this design prompt, dancing your PhD. And if you think about it, I think you'll agree that a project like this has a lot of potential to be really exceptionally bad. Just a total chaotic, confusing mismatch between the content message and the medium and the necessary TPAC components. And this is an example of TPAC in action, all the different components coming together to teach us about zebrafish larvae and why we should care how they move as a group. And yet, it doesn't fall apart. It's not terrible. It's not only successful as instructional media, I think it's as successful as art, which is, by the way, super hard to pull off. I don't think I've ever done it. I don't necessarily expect I ever will. And though I'm tempted to say that this success is all down to editing and structure and really good instructional design thinking, and that's certainly there, if you listen to John Bohannon's talk from the end of this week's reading list, he's talking about scientists who are using dance in the assembly cut phases of their research. They are collaborating with dancers to generate the rawest raw material to take back and edit and structure and then test out in their labs. They are creating these design constraints first thing, saying that they're going to use dance from step one, and then sticking with it and seeing where that constrained design perspective takes them and what they can learn through that constraint. So, what I want you to take away from this discussion about video media is the ability to look at videos as examples of structured, designed objects, and to recognize the different ways structure can emerge through a design. You can go in high concept with a clear overall structure in mind from the beginning, like with Dance Your PhD or my weird chiastic unit plan. Or you may be starting from the ground up with just a wall full of index cards of relevant knowledge, but no defined plan or structure beyond that. But as you make those initial design decisions, you start shaping, start structuring how the rest of your process will respond to those and how your students' experiences and their choices in a lesson will respond to those initial decisions. It's really easy today to just throw more content into your classroom and hope some of it sticks. It's really easy. But like I said at the start, when you have so many options, less is more. There is no perfect movie. There is no perfect lesson plan. There is just the best design you can produce under the constraints you are given. So that's what we should all be striving for. Okay, I think I've taken up enough of your time. If you haven't watched the other remaining videos for this week, go do that. They're way more fun than this. I am looking forward to your check-ins this week and to seeing you think about structure in your next lesson plan drafts, and I will talk to you all again real soon.